Hello, and thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Really glad you're here today.
Welcome. Yeah, we're about to unpack some really powerful source material that you've shared with us. We'll be exploring something crucial. The complex connection between our emotions and the journey of addiction.
That's right. And our goal today, it isn't just to summarize, we really want to dig into these sources together with you
Mm-hmm.
to try and understand how difficult feelings can get sort of tangled up with substance use and, other addictive behaviors.
And just as importantly, we want to look at the pathways the sources point towards, pathways for healing, for finding healthier ways to cope.
Exactly. And we're approaching this with, well, a lot of compassion and a real desire to understand.
So let's start by maybe setting the scene a bit, this emotional landscape of addiction.
Yeah.
When we looked at the material you sent, what really stands out immediately is that, look, addiction isn't simple. It's a mix of things, biology, psychology, social factors, and it has this profound impact on how we feel, on our emotional well-being.
And, for anyone who's been through recovery or maybe knows someone who has, you'll know that difficult emotions, those unpleasant feelings, they're a huge part of the experience,
Yeah.
especially early on.
Yeah.
It can feel like your feelings are just louder,
Yeah.
maybe even overwhelming sometimes.
And the sources offer a really interesting insight into maybe why that is. They suggest these feelings can feel more intense precisely because your natural ability to regulate emotions is actually recovering.
Recovering from the substance use.
Exactly, recovering from the long-term effects. It's, believe it or not, part of the healing process, but it can be incredibly challenging to go through.
That brings up a key concept that was mentioned quite a bit in the sources, emotional dysregulation, or ED.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds kind of technical, doesn't it? But how would someone actually experience that? Like, day to day, what does that difficulty regulating emotions feel like?
That's a great question. Think of it as, well, struggling to manage the intensity of your emotional responses, or maybe how long they last.
Okay.
So a small annoyance might trigger this huge wave of anger, or, a feeling of sadness might just feel impossible to shake off.
Right.
And the sources link ED not just to various mental health issues, but very strongly to addictive behaviors, too.
So things like substance use, but also behavioral addictions,
Yeah.
like gambling.
Yeah, exactly. Everything
Yeah.
from substance use to those behavioral addictions.
So it's not just having the emotions, it's that struggle to effectively handle them that seems to be the crucial piece here.
Precisely. And the sources point out something specific: difficulties in controlling impulses, especially when you're faced with negative emotions. That's particularly tied to the addictions they studied.
Ah, okay. That urge to act out or, use something when you feel bad.
That's where ED and addiction really intersect.
And it makes sense because, like the source describes, substances are often picked up, at least initially, as a way to cope, aren't they?
Absolutely. When you're feeling overwhelmed by stress, anxiety, depression, maybe dealing with past trauma or grief, substances can offer what feels like temporary relief.
Like a quick fix.
Yeah, they can numb the pain, offer distraction.
The classic idea of self-medication.
Yes. But here's the catch, the trap the sources really highlight: that relief is just temporary. It
Yeah.
feels real, but it doesn't actually solve the underlying emotional pain.
Right.
And over time, relying on substances to cope, it actually damages your brain's natural ability to regulate emotions. So it makes the original problems even worse.
Oh, wow.
It creates this powerful negative feedback loop. You feel bad, you feel worse in the long run, your ability to cope goes down, and round it goes.
Let's maybe zoom in on some specific emotions then, because the sources gave some really nuanced views. Starting with shame and guilt.
Okay.
One description that really struck me was calling shame a hidden struggle. Like, it's often right there at the core of the distress and addiction, but frequently just not talked about.
Yeah,
Unacknowledged.
it really operates beneath the surface, and the sources show how it triggers all sorts of defensive reactions.
Like what?
Well, things like lashing out at other people or turning that anger inward on yourself, or maybe withdrawing completely, avoiding anything that might bring up that feeling.
So those behaviors aren't the shame itself. They're like shields, ways to cover it up.
Exactly. They're shields built to mask the shame.
And that just feeds right back into the cycle you mentioned, doesn't it?
Uh,
Shame pushes someone towards the addictive behavior to escape the feeling.
mm-hmm.
And then the behavior itself often creates more shame. It just perpetuates itself.
It's a really vicious circle, truly. And this raises a really important question that the sources kind of prompt us to think about. Are shame and guilt always negative, just destructive forces?
Hmm.
The material suggests actually a potential perspective shift. While they feel awful, no question, with the right support, the right reframing, experiences of guilt and shame can become motivators
Motivators for what?
for self-reflection, for positive change.
How does that shift happen, though? Like, because they feel so paralyzing.
Well, compassion is absolutely key, especially self-compassion. Learning to be kinder, more understanding towards yourself, that helps dismantle the shame. It chips away at that self-stigma that's so often tied to addiction.
Okay.
And the sources also suggest something else. Voluntarily exposing those shame-based vulnerabilities, choosing to share them with trusted people in a safe space, that can dramatically reduce their power.
Like bringing it out into the light.
Kind of like that, yeah. Sunlight is often the best disinfectant for shame, as they say.
Now, there was a surprising finding related to another emotion, sadness.
Yes, that was interesting.
When researchers looked at which negative emotions predicted smoking and relapse over a long period.
They found something unexpected. Sadness, actually more reliably than fear or anger or even shame, predicted both current smoking and relapse in this one particular long-term study.
Wow. Sadness, not anger or anxiety, which you might immediately think of. Why? Why do the sources suggest that link is so strong?
Well, the research points towards it being less about the raw feeling of sadness itself and more about the thinking patterns that often go along with it.
Okay.
Specifically, a kind of intense self-focus. When someone gets caught in that rumination, that self-focused thinking that's typical of sadness, it can lead to impatience, and impatience for immediate comfort or reward.
Like needing a quick hit of something.
Exactly, like needing a cigarette puff right now. And this impatience, driven by that self-focus, seems to drive the consumption behavior. It's a specific cognitive dynamic they found linked to sadness.
That's really specific. A fascinating insight. Okay, let's move to anger. The sources talk about a pretty significant link seen in clinical settings between anger, violence, and substance use.
Yeah, unfortunately, that connection shows up a lot in treatment settings, and it's really vital here to understand the distinctions the sources make.
Yeah.
Anger is the emotion, the feeling. Aggression is the behavior specifically, behavior intended to cause harm. And hostility is more of an underlying attitude, like generally disliking others.
So you can feel really angry without being aggressive.
Absolutely. They are not the same thing.
But even if it's not physical violence, inappropriate expression of anger like yelling, verbal abuse that still has major negative consequences, right?
No, absolutely. Alienating people, losing jobs, feeling intense guilt, more shame, even getting kicked out of recovery programs. The fallout is real.
Yeah.
And the sources acknowledge that sometimes people perceive payoffs from aggressive outbursts, maybe a temporary release of tension or a warped sense of control by intimidating others.
But those are short-lived.
Very short-lived. And ultimately, they're completely overshadowed by the real lasting damage those behaviors cause.
And the sources also talked about some common myths around anger, didn't they?
They did. Like the idea that some people are just, born angry, or that you have to be aggressive to get your needs met.
Are those true?
The material basically debunks them as myths. While maybe our facial expressions when angry or how our nervous system reacts might have some genetic components, how we choose to express anger behaviorally, that's largely learned,
One from where?
often from observing our families growing up or others around us. But the good news is, because it's learned,
It can be unlearned.
it can be unlearned and changed. Absolutely.
Okay. What about that other myth? The idea that aggressively venting anger is always healthy. Just let it out.
Yeah, the sources point out that research actually suggests kind of the opposite. Expressing anger aggressively tends to just reinforce the aggressive behavior. It makes you better at being angry, essentially.
Wow.
It doesn't usually resolve the underlying issue or feeling. It's not really a healthy release. It's more like practicing a negative behavior pattern.
Got it. Okay, one more specific emotion to touch on. Anxiety. The sources describe it as one of the most common and often really intense, unpleasant emotions someone experiences in early recovery.
It makes total sense when you think about it. Anxiety in general is a natural signal, right? It tells us something needs attention or action.
But too much of it.
Too much anxiety can be incredibly disabling, and it significantly raises the risk of relapse. The sources also frame it, though, partly as a sign of healing.
Healing? How so?
As the body and mind are adjusting to functioning without substances, that readjustment process itself can manifest as heightened anxiety. It's part of the system recalibrating.
Okay, Let's maybe deepen these connections now, especially thinking about how trauma fits into this picture and how these emotional cycles can get going.
Yes.
The sources really strongly highlight the correlation between trauma, exposure, and substance abuse, particularly in young people.
That link is critical. The statistics are stark. A very high percentage of adolescents who enter treatment have some kind of trauma history.
And it works both ways, doesn't it? The relationship is bidirectional.
Exactly. Trauma can absolutely lead someone to use substances. It becomes a way to try and cope with the overwhelming, sometimes unbearable feelings and memories. A way to numb out.
But the substance use itself can also.
It can also increase someone's risk of experiencing trauma, because substance use can lower inhibitions, lead to risky situations, impaired judgment.
Right. And how does this tie back to that idea of emotional regulation we started with?
Well, young people who are dealing with both trauma and substance abuse often have really profound difficulties with emotional and behavioral regulation. It's like a double hit.
Making recovery even harder.
Significantly harder.
Yeah.
The sources give this example, Raphael, a teenager who used marijuana and alcohol specifically to numb those overwhelming feelings tied to his past trauma.
So for him, it wasn't about chasing a high.
Less about seeking pleasure, according to the case, and more about desperately trying to manage these internal states that he just didn't have other tools for.
Wow. The sources also describe something called the aggression cycle. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, it's a useful model. It's often broken down into 3 phases: buildup, explosion, and aftermath.
Okay.
It basically illustrates how anger can escalate step by step into aggressive behavior. And the core goal in managing anger, as the sources really emphasize, isn't just stopping the explosion itself.
It's intervening earlier.
Exactly. It's learning to recognize the signs and intervene during the buildup phase before you reach that peak intensity where you lose control.
Because that explosion phase is like hitting maybe a 10 on that anger meter idea.
Right.
Leading straight to those negative consequences we talked about.
Precisely. So learning to spot when your anger is just starting to climb, maybe it's only at a 3 or 4, that's crucial. It gives you a chance to use coping skills before it gets destructive.
Okay, so it's not just about describing the problem. Thankfully, the sources offer pathways forward towards healing, building resilience.
Yes, absolutely. There are evidence-based strategies out there for managing these difficult emotions and supporting recovery.
One foundational approach mentioned a lot is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. Most people have probably heard of it. But the core idea the sources reinforce seems really powerful.
Yeah.
By changing how we think about things.
Our cognitions.
Right. And how we act in response.
Our behaviors.
We can fundamentally change how we feel.
Exactly. And CBT provides really practical tools for this. Like for managing anger, the sources mention things like that anger meter we just talked about, a simple 0 to 10 scale.
Okay.
And also something called an anger awareness record. These aren't just abstract concepts, they're actual tracking tools.
They help you see patterns.
Yes. To help you become more aware of your specific triggers, those early warning signs, physical cues, emotional shifts, and the actual consequences of your responses, both good and bad.
It helps you connect the dots you might otherwise miss. And there are specific cognitive techniques too, right? Like the ABCD model.
Right. The ABCD model is great for breaking down a challenging situation. You look at the activating event, then your beliefs about it, what you told yourself, then the emotional and behavioral consequences of those beliefs, and crucially, the D is for disputing.
Challenging the unhelpful thoughts.
Exactly. Challenging those unhelpful or irrational beliefs with more balanced, realistic thinking. It's about catching those automatic negative thoughts. Another quick technique mentioned is thought stopping.
Which is like, it sounds.
Pretty much. Literally training yourself to halt those escalating negative thought spirals in their tracks. An immediate intervention.
Okay. And shifting to the behavior side, how we act, developing assertive communication skills seems vital.
Huge. It's about finding that balance. Instead of becoming aggressive or just being completely passive and silent.
You learn to actually express your feelings.
Yeah.
And your needs, your boundaries.
Yes, but respectfully. It's about valuing yourself and valuing the other person. One part of the material put it nicely. The core message of assertion is something like, my feelings, thoughts, and beliefs are important.
Okay.
And your feelings, thoughts, and beliefs are equally important. It's mutual respect.
That's a great way to frame it. What about other behavioral strategies?
Relaxation techniques are key. Things like practicing deep breathing or progressive muscle relaxation.
Do those really work when you're feeling intense emotion?
They can, especially with practice. It's not just about feeling a little calmer in the moment, though that helps. It actually physiologically counteracts the stress or anger response.
Oh.
Your body finds it very difficult to be highly agitated and deeply relaxed at the exact same time. They're kind of incompatible states. But the sources really emphasize practice is key. Consistency makes them effective when you need them.
Makes sense. And something maybe more fundamental, just maintaining a healthy lifestyle.
Foundational, yeah.
Mhm.
The sources describe it as foundational for emotional stability and recovery. Things like consistent sleep, trying to eat nutritiously, physical activity, having some routine and structure to your day,
Simple things, but powerful.
and also consciously avoiding negative inputs, like constantly blaming other people or dwelling endlessly on past negative events. That kind of stuff fuels negative emotions.
Okay. Beyond the traditional CBT stuff, the sources also touched on newer approaches, right? Like acceptance commitment therapy, ACT, and positive psychology.
Yes, they mentioned how these can really enhance recovery, building on CBT.
How do those fit in? What do they add?
Well, ACT and mindfulness practices, they help you cultivate awareness. Awareness of difficult emotions or cravings, but seeing them not as absolute commands you must obey or threats you have to fight.
More like.
More like transient internal experiences, like clouds passing in the sky. This helps foster a more reflective stance. You can notice the feeling or the thought without automatically having to react to it.
So you create some space between the feeling and your response.
Exactly. You observe it, you acknowledge it, maybe, but you don't necessarily have to act on it or believe it as the absolute truth about you or the situation.
Okay. And positive psychology, what does that bring?
Positive psychology brings in this focus on identifying and actively building on your personal strengths. What are you good at? What resources do you have inside you?
Shifting focus from deficits to assets.
Right, and actively cultivating hope. The sources describe hope not just as, wishful thinking, but as a really vital force for resilience, for sustained recovery. It's about believing change is possible and feeling like you have the agency, the power to pursue it.
And the focus on values and purpose that seemed really important too, like it provides the why.
Precisely. Identifying your core personal values, what truly matters to you deep down, and then setting meaningful goals that align with those values. That provides a much deeper, more sustainable motivation than just trying to avoid substances.
So it's not just running away from the negative.
It shifts the focus to actively moving towards a positive, fulfilling future, a future that truly resonates with who you want to be.
So, okay, bringing everything together that we've explored from these sources, it's really clear there's this deep, often very difficult, but incredibly important connection between emotions like shame, sadness, anger, anxiety, and the struggle with addiction.
Yes, and I think a key takeaway is that these emotions, as hard as they are, aren't just roadblocks. They're not just negative experiences to be, numbed or avoided at all costs.
Right.
With the right support and using the kinds of strategies we talked about, the tools from CBT, the acceptance from ACT, mindfulness, focusing on strengths and values, they can actually become catalysts for profound change and real healing.
There are practical, proven approaches available, ways to build healthier coping mechanisms, to strengthen those emotional regulation skills that might have been damaged.
And maybe the most crucial message woven throughout all the sources really is the absolute importance of seeking and accepting support.
You can't do it alone.
It's incredibly hard to do alone, whether that support comes from therapy, individual, group, family, or dedicated support groups, or even just leaning on trusted friends and loved ones. Connection is just a vital piece of this recovery journey.
This deep dive, it really underscores how understanding our inner emotional world isn't separate from our external struggles or behaviors.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to addiction and finding a path to recovery, they're deeply intertwined.
They really are. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something that feels drawn from the spirit of these sources.
Okay.
Consider the power of understanding your own emotional signals, even the really difficult ones. Seeing them not as flaws to be hidden or problems to be immediately fixed or numbed, but as information.
Information.
Yeah, information. Data, maybe? Information that, with conscious effort, with support, can actually become a kind of map. A map guiding you towards a stronger, more self-aware, and ultimately a more fulfilling life beyond addiction.
A powerful thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.